Have you ever watched someone walk into a room and just feel different? People turn toward them, doors seem to open. Money and opportunity find their way to them, while you work just as hard and somehow stay stuck in the same place. It is easy to call it luck. It is easy to think they were simply born with something you weren't. But that is not the truth, and deep down, you already sense it. The truth is that the energy you carry every single day is shaping the life you are living right now. And the good news is that this energy can be trained, starting today, with simple daily habits anyone can learn. In the chapters ahead, you will discover exactly how to build that inner strength, release the fear holding you back, and become the kind of person wealth and opportunity move toward. Stay with me. This could change everything. Chapter 1. Discover how your inner energy shapes your outer success. There is a kind of energy you carry that has nothing to do with money, status, or luck. It moves with you into every room you enter. It speaks before your mouth opens. It is felt in a handshake, in the way you stand when you're tired, in the way you answer the phone when you didn't expect the call. People sense it even when they can't name it. Some call it presence. Some call it vibe. The old teachers called it aura. Whatever word you choose, this energy is not mysterious or magical. It is built, day by day, out of the thoughts you repeat, the habits you keep, and the way you treat yourself when no one else is watching. This chapter is about that energy, not as a vague spiritual idea, but as something you can train the same way you train a muscle. Wealth, real wealth, the kind that lasts and multiplies and brings peace instead of anxiety, does not begin with a bank account. It begins with the internal state a person carries into the world every single day. If you want to understand why some people seem to attract opportunity, trust, and resources, while others work just as hard and stay stuck, you have to stop looking at their bank statements and start looking at their inner world. That is where the real difference lives. Think about the last time you walked into a room and felt small. Maybe you were underdressed, maybe you didn't know anyone, maybe you doubted you belonged there. Your shoulders dropped. Your voice got quieter. You avoided eye contact. Now think about a time you walked into a room feeling sure of yourself. Maybe you had just finished something difficult, or you were simply in a good mood for no clear reason. Your steps were different. Your voice carried. People responded to you differently. Not because you were a different person, but because you were broadcasting a different signal. That signal is your inner energy, and it is constantly being read by everyone around you, whether you intend it or not. This is not about faking confidence or performing positivity. Faking does not work for long, and people can usually sense the difference between real steadiness and a mask. What we are talking about here is something deeper and more durable. It is the quiet strength a person builds through discipline, through facing hard truths about themselves, through choosing their thoughts on purpose, instead of letting random fear and noise run the show. This is closer to what the old philosophers meant by virtue than what modern marketing means by confidence. It is earned, not borrowed. Here is the first truth you need to accept if you want to change your outer results. Your outer life is downstream from your inner state. Not in a magical sense, but in a very practical, observable sense. A person who is constantly anxious about money will often make rushed, fear-based decisions. They will undervalue themselves in negotiations. They will avoid asking for what they deserve because they are afraid of rejection. They will project scarcity, and scarcity is contagious. People sense it and they pull back, even if they cannot explain why. On the other hand, a person who has done the inner work to feel calm and grounded, even when their bank account is not yet where they want it to be, will negotiate from a place of steadiness. They will ask for what they are worth. They will not chase opportunities out of desperation, which paradoxically makes opportunities more likely to come to them, because people are drawn to steadiness and repelled by desperation. This is not wishful thinking. This is human psychology playing out in real situations every single day. Employers hire people who seem capable of handling pressure. Investors back founders who project clarity, not panic. Customers trust businesses that communicate with calm authority instead of frantic urgency. Your inner state leaks out through your tone of voice, your posture, your eye contact, your pacing, even your handwriting and the way you respond to emails. None of this is supernatural. It is simply cause and effect played out through human behavior. So how do you actually train this energy instead of just hoping it improves on its own? The first step is awareness, and this is where most people skip ahead too quickly. They want the technique before they understand the problem. But you cannot change what you refuse to notice. Start paying close attention to your internal weather. Notice when you feel tight in the chest, when your thoughts start racing, when you feel the urge to check your phone for validation, when you feel small in front of someone you perceive as powerful. Do not judge these feelings, just notice them, the way a scientist observes data. Write them down if you need to. This single habit of noticing your internal state without immediately reacting to it is one of the most powerful disciplines a person can build. And almost nobody does it because it requires slowing down in a world that rewards speed. Once you start noticing your internal state, the second step is choosing your response instead of letting the reaction choose you. This is the heart of self-mastery. A person who has not trained themselves will feel fear and immediately shrink. They will feel doubt and immediately quit. They will feel rejected and immediately spiral into self-criticism. A person who has trained themselves will still feel the fear, the doubt, the sting of rejection, because we are human and these feelings are not optional. But they will pause, they will breathe, they will ask themselves a simple question: what response right now actually serves the life I am trying to build? Then they will choose that response, even if it is uncomfortable, even if the old pattern is screaming at them to retreat. This pause, this gap between feeling and reacting, is where your power lives. Most people never build it because they have never practiced it. It is a skill, not a personality trait. You build it the same way you build any skill, through repetition under real conditions. Every time you feel triggered today, whether by a rude comment, a bill you weren't expecting, a missed opportunity, or a comparison to someone who seems further ahead, treat it as a training rep. Pause. Breathe once, slowly. Ask yourself what response actually serves your future self, then act from that place. Do this consistently, and within a few weeks you will notice you are simply harder to rattle than you used to be. That steadiness becomes part of your presence. People feel it. They begin to trust you more, lean on you more, offer you more, because steady people attract responsibility and reward in a way that anxious people never do. Let's talk about a real and very common scenario. Picture someone applying for a higher paying position, or pitching a client, or asking for a raise. Most people walk into that conversation carrying months of internal noise, doubts about whether they deserve it, fear of being told no, resentment that they even have to ask. All of that noise comes through in subtle ways: a slight stammer, an apologetic tone, eyes that drop to the floor, a tendency to undersell their own value before the other person even has a chance to push back. The other party senses this hesitation, even if they cannot name it, and they respond to it. They offer less. They negotiate harder. They sense the opening because the energy in the room invited it. Now picture a different version of that same person who has spent the prior weeks training their inner state. They have practiced sitting with discomfort without panicking. They have practiced separating their self-worth from the outcome of a single conversation. They walk into the same room. Their voice is even. Their eye contact is steady, not aggressive, just present. They state their value clearly because they have already settled the question internally, before the conversation even started. The other party feels this differently. There is no opening to push for less because nothing in the room is signaling desperation. This is not about clever scripts or manipulation tactics. It is about the simple, observable fact that people respond to your internal state far more than they respond to your words. This is why so much advice about wealth and success misses the point. People obsess over tactics, the right email template, the right pitch deck, the right resume format, while ignoring the internal state they are bringing into every interaction. Tactics matter, but they are amplifiers. An anxious, scarcity-driven person with a perfect script will still leak anxiety through their tone and posture. A grounded, disciplined person with an average script will often outperform them because people are drawn to steadiness on a level deeper than logic. Building this steadiness daily requires a few simple, repeatable practices. And the key word is repeatable. Grand gestures do not build inner strength. Small, boring, consistent actions do. Begin each morning with a few minutes of total stillness before you touch your phone. This single habit interrupts the modern pattern of waking up and immediately absorbing other people's opinions, anxieties, and demands before you have even had a chance to check in with your own mind. During this stillness, do not try to force positive thoughts. Just breathe and notice. This builds the muscle of being present with yourself without needing external noise to feel okay. Throughout the day, practice what we might call energetic honesty. This means noticing when you are performing a version of yourself to please others or to seem more successful than you feel, and gently dropping the performance. Performance is exhausting, and it drains the very energy you are trying to build. Real steadiness comes from alignment between your inner state and your outer behavior, not from constructing an impressive image. The moment you stop performing and start simply being disciplined and honest with yourself, your energy becomes lighter, clearer, and far more attractive to others, because people can feel the difference between a performance and a presence. At the end of each day, take 5 minutes to review your reactions. Where did you feel small today? Where did you shrink when you could have stood steady? Where did you handle a difficult moment with calm instead of panic? This is not about self-criticism. It is about collecting data on yourself so you can train more precisely tomorrow. Athletes review film. Musicians review their practice sessions. You should review your own emotional responses with the same discipline, because this is the training ground for the energy you bring into every wealth-building opportunity in your life. Understand something clearly. Discipline here is not punishment, it is respect. Every time you choose a steady response over a reactive one, you are telling yourself, on a deep level, that you are someone worth being calm for, worth protecting from your own worst impulses, worth building into someone stronger. This self-respect compounds. It becomes the foundation beneath everything else you will build in your financial life, your relationships, and your sense of purpose. You do not need to wait until your circumstances improve to begin this work. In fact, waiting is the trap that keeps most people stuck for years. The energy you build today, in the middle of whatever difficulty you are currently facing, is the same energy that will eventually attract the opportunities you are hoping for. Wealth does not flow toward chaos. It flows toward order, calm, and clarity, because those qualities make a person easier to trust, easier to work with, and easier to believe in. Starting today, treat your inner state as the most valuable asset you own, more valuable than any single paycheck or opportunity, because it is the asset that determines how you respond to every paycheck and every opportunity for the rest of your life. Train it the way a disciplined person trains anything worth having, with patience, consistency, and honesty about where you currently stand. The outer world you are hoping to build, the wealth, the respect, the freedom, is waiting on the other side of the inner world you are willing to build first. Begin there, and everything else has the room it needs to grow. Chapter 2. Build a magnetic aura that draws wealth and opportunity. There is a moment right before something good happens to a person where you can almost feel it coming. A door opens that wasn't supposed to open yet. A stranger offers help they didn't have to give. A client says yes faster than expected. People often call this luck, but if you study the lives of those it happens to again and again, you start to notice something. It rarely happens to the same person only once. It happens to them repeatedly, across different seasons of their life, in different industries, with different people involved. That repetition tells you something important. This is not random. Something about the person themselves is drawing these moments toward them, and that something can be built on purpose. We are going to call this quality a magnetic aura, not because it is mystical, but because magnetism is the most accurate description of what is actually happening. A magnet does not chase metal across a table. It simply exists in a certain state, and the metal moves toward it because the conditions are right. Wealth and opportunity behave the same way around certain people. These people are not always the loudest, the most credentialed, or even the hardest working in the room. But they carry something that makes others want to be near them, trust them, include them, and give them a chance. That something is built through a handful of specific qualities, and each one can be developed with intention. The first quality is clarity. A person who knows exactly what they stand for, what they want, and what they will not compromise on creates a kind of gravitational pull simply by existing without confusion. Most people drift. They say yes to things they don't want, chase opportunities that don't fit them, and change their direction every time someone criticizes them. This constant drifting makes them difficult to trust, because nobody can predict where they will be standing tomorrow. A person with clarity is different. Even if their goals are still far from reality, the direction is firm. People sense this firmness, and they want to attach themselves to it, because human beings are drawn to certainty in a world full of noise. Building this clarity does not require having your entire life figured out. It requires sitting down on purpose and writing out exactly what you are building toward and why it matters to you, not someone else's version of success, yours. Read it back to yourself weekly. Adjust it as you learn, but stop drifting. The moment you choose a direction and hold it steady, you will notice people start treating you differently, because you have given them something solid to respond to. The second quality is generosity without depletion. This is a subtle distinction that most people get wrong. They think magnetism means giving everything away, being endlessly available, saying yes to every request so people will like them. This actually repels opportunity over time because it signals desperation and a lack of boundaries. Real generosity comes from a place of fullness, not emptiness. It looks like sharing useful information freely, giving credit where it's due, helping someone without immediately calculating what you'll get back, and doing this while still protecting your time and energy. People remember who helped them when there was nothing obvious in it for that person. They come back to those people first when they have something valuable to offer. Start practicing this in small ways immediately. Share a useful contact without being asked. Compliment someone's work specifically and honestly. Offer a piece of advice that costs you nothing but might save someone else real time or money. Do this consistently without keeping score, and you will find that doors begin opening that you never directly knocked on. The third quality is composure under disappointment. Anyone can appear magnetic when things are going well. The real test, and the real builder of lasting presence, is how you carry yourself when things fall apart. A deal collapses, a client ghosts you, a project you poured months into gets rejected. Most people in these moments either collapse into visible despair or explode into visible anger, both of which push opportunity away rather than drawing it closer. The person who stays composed, who absorbs the disappointment without letting it spill onto everyone around them, becomes someone others want to work with during hard times, and hard times are exactly when the biggest opportunities tend to surface. Practice this by treating every setback as a private matter to process internally before you respond externally. Feel the disappointment fully when you're alone. Then, when you face others, lead with steadiness rather than the raw emotion. This is not suppression, it is sequencing. Feel it first in private. Respond from a clearer place in public. The fourth quality is precision in your word. This means doing what you say you will do, every single time, even when it is inconvenient. Most people break small promises constantly, showing up late, forgetting commitments, half-finishing tasks, and they don't think it matters because the promises seem minor. But every broken promise, no matter how small, quietly erodes the trust others place in you, and trust is the actual currency that opportunity runs on. Nobody hands a large opportunity to someone they cannot rely on for small ones. Begin tightening this immediately. If you say you will respond by tomorrow, even if the answer is simply that you need more time. If you commit to being somewhere at a certain time, build in margin so you arrive early instead of rushing in late. This single habit, kept consistently over months, builds a kind of reputation that money cannot buy directly, and that reputation becomes one of the strongest forms of magnetism a person can have. The fifth quality is genuine curiosity about other people. Magnetic people are rarely the ones talking the most. They are usually the ones asking real questions and actually listening to the answers, remembering details, following up later. Most people, when meeting someone new, are secretly waiting for their turn to talk about themselves. This creates a subtle but noticeable hollowness in the interaction. The person who instead asks thoughtful questions, who remembers what someone told them weeks ago and brings it up again, who shows real interest in another person's challenges and goals, becomes rare and memorable in a way that loud self-promotion never achieves. Start this practice in your very next conversation. Ask one more question than feels natural. Listen for what the other person actually cares about, not just what they're saying on the surface. Follow up on it later. This single shift in attention, repeated across dozens of interactions, builds a kind of trust and warmth that draws people back to you again and again. None of these 5 qualities require money, connections, or luck to begin building today. They require discipline, repetition, and an honest look at where you currently fall short in each one. Pick the quality that feels weakest in you right now and give it your full attention for the next 30 days. Notice how people respond differently as you sharpen it. Wealth and opportunity are not chasing the loudest or the most desperate. They are drawn toward the steady, the clear, the generous, the composed, and the genuinely curious. Build these qualities with patience, and you will not need to chase opportunity at all. It will begin finding you. Chapter 3. Train your mind daily to radiate confidence and power. Confidence is not a feeling that arrives when life finally gets easy. It is a state you build through repetition, the same way a blacksmith builds the strength in his arm through thousands of small strikes against the same piece of metal. Most people wait for proof before they feel confident. They wait for the promotion, the bigger bank balance, the compliment from someone they respect, and only then do they allow themselves to stand a little taller. This is backward. The people who build real, lasting confidence do the opposite. They train the mind first, deliberately and daily, and the external proof follows later as a natural result of how they already think and carry themselves. Power, in the way we are using it here, has nothing to do with controlling other people or dominating a room. It is the quiet sense that you can handle whatever situation life places in front of you, that you are not at the mercy of every passing mood or every harsh word someone throws your way. This kind of power is built in private, far from any audience, through the way you talk to yourself when nobody else is listening. That inner conversation, the one running constantly in the background of your mind, is the actual training ground. Most people never examine it. They let it run on autopilot, repeating old fears and old criticisms from years ago, and then they wonder why they feel weak in moments that demand strength. Start paying close attention to the exact words your mind uses when you face a small difficulty today. Notice the language. Is it harsh? Is it doubtful? Does it say things like, "I always mess this up," or "I'm not good enough for this," or "What if I fail in front of everyone?" These phrases feel like simple passing thoughts, but they are not neutral. Every time you repeat a phrase like this internally, you are reinforcing a neural pathway, strengthening a habit of thought the same way repeated practice strengthens a habit of movement. The mind does not know the difference between a thought you mean seriously and a thought you repeat carelessly. It treats repetition as instruction. Whatever you rehearse most often becomes the script your mind reaches for automatically under pressure. This is why training your mind daily matters so much more than trying to feel confident only on the days that matter, like an interview or a big presentation. By the time that important day arrives, your mental habits are already set. You cannot build a new internal voice in the morning before a big meeting if you have spent the previous 6 months feeding yourself doubt. The work has to happen on the ordinary days, the boring Tuesday afternoons, the quiet moments stuck in traffic, the small frustrations of daily life. These ordinary moments are actually the most valuable training ground you have, because they happen constantly and they ask very little of you, which means you can practice a new way of thinking thousands of times before you ever need it in a high-stakes moment. Begin with a simple practice of catching and correcting harsh self-talk the moment you notice it. This is different from blind positive thinking, where you force yourself to repeat statements you don't actually believe. Forced positivity often backfires because part of your mind recognizes the lie and pushes back against it. Instead, aim for accurate and strong language rather than exaggerated language. If your mind says, "I always fail at this," correct it internally to "This attempt didn't work, and I can adjust my approach." If your mind says, "Everyone is judging me right now," correct it to "I don't actually know what anyone else is thinking, and I am allowed to focus on my own next step." Notice how this corrected language is not falsely cheerful. It is simply more honest and more useful than the exaggerated, fear-driven version your mind defaults to. Practicing this correction, even just 3 or 4 times a day, slowly rewires the automatic script your mind reaches for. Confidence also depends heavily on the evidence you allow yourself to remember. Most people carry a long mental list of every mistake they've made, replayed in vivid detail, while their actual accomplishments fade into the background, barely acknowledged. This creates a deeply skewed internal record, one that constantly tells you that you are more likely to fail than succeed, when the truth of your own history almost certainly says otherwise. Build a different record on purpose. At the end of each day, write down one thing you handled well, no matter how small. It does not need to be dramatic. Maybe you stayed calm during an annoying phone call. Maybe you finished a task you had been avoiding. Maybe you spoke up in a meeting when you usually stay quiet. Write it down in a single sentence. Over weeks, this becomes a written record of your own competence, something concrete you can return to on the days your mind tries to convince you that you are not capable. Confidence built on a real, written record is far sturdier than confidence built on a passing mood, because moods change daily, but a written record stays exactly as true as the day you wrote it. The way you use language out loud matters just as much as the way you talk to yourself internally, because the two influence each other constantly. Pay attention to how often you hedge your statements when speaking to others. Phrases like "I think," "maybe," "I'm not sure," but kind of, "this might be a bad idea," but are small verbal habits that signal uncertainty, and your own mind listens to your own voice just as closely as the people around you do. Every time you hear yourself hedge unnecessarily, you are quietly teaching your own brain that you are someone who is unsure. This does not mean you should speak with false certainty about things you genuinely don't know. Honesty matters more than the appearance of confidence. But notice the difference between necessary honesty and habitual hedging. There is a real difference between saying, "I haven't finished researching this, so I want to be careful about overstating my answer," which is honest and clear, and saying, I guess this could work, which is the same idea buried under a pile of weakening language. Practice trimming the unnecessary hedges from your speech this week. Say what you mean directly. Notice how this single habit, repeated across dozens of conversations, begins to change how you feel internally, not just how others perceive you. Posture and breath are physical tools that directly influence your mental state, and the connection runs in both directions. Most people think confidence produces good posture, but research and simple personal experiment both show that posture also produces confidence. When you slump your shoulders, drop your chin, and breathe in shallow, rapid breaths, your body sends a signal to your brain that matches fear and submission, and your brain often follows that signal even if nothing threatening is actually happening. When you stand or sit upright, relax your shoulders down and back, and take slow, deep breaths from your stomach rather than your chest. Your body sends the opposite signal. Your brain reads this as safety and capability. Before any moment today that asks something difficult of you, whether it's a hard conversation, a phone call you've been avoiding, or simply walking into a crowded room, take 15 seconds to adjust your physical state first. Roll your shoulders back, lift your chin slightly, take 3 slow breaths, making the exhale longer than the inhale. This is not a trick or a gimmick. It is a direct lever on your nervous system, and it works because your body and mind are not separate systems giving each other suggestions. They are one integrated system constantly exchanging information. Mental rehearsal is another powerful daily practice, separate from simply hoping things go well. Before any situation that makes you nervous, spend 2 or 3 minutes picturing yourself moving through it with steadiness. Do not picture a fantasy version where everything goes perfectly and everyone applauds. Picture something more realistic and more useful. Yourself face a difficult question, pausing, breathing, and answering calmly. Picture yourself hearing criticism and not flinching, simply absorbing it and responding with composure. This kind of rehearsal trains your nervous system to treat the situation as familiar before it even happens, because your brain does not fully distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a lived one. Athletes have used this for decades to prepare for competition, not because it replaces real practice, but because it reduces the shock of the unfamiliar, and shock is one of the biggest reasons people lose their composure under pressure. Handling criticism without losing your footing is one of the clearest tests of whether your confidence is real or just decoration. Most people respond to criticism in one of two unhelpful ways. They either collapse into shame, accepting every word as proof of their own inadequacy, or they snap into defensive anger, rejecting the criticism outright without considering whether any of it holds value. Both reactions come from the same root cause, treating the criticism as a direct measure of your worth as a person, rather than simply information about a specific action or piece of work. Train yourself to separate the two. When someone criticizes something you did, silently ask yourself one question before reacting outwardly. Is there anything useful in this that I can actually use? If yes, take that piece and quietly set the rest aside. If no, let it pass without absorbing it into your sense of self. This single mental habit, practiced consistently, builds a kind of durability that nothing else quite matches, because you stop needing every interaction to go perfectly in order to feel stable. There is also real value in deliberately practicing small discomforts on a regular basis, not because suffering is noble, but because controlled discomfort is one of the most efficient ways to train your mind's relationship with difficulty. This does not need to be extreme. It might mean making a phone call you've been avoiding instead of sending an email. It might mean speaking up in a meeting where staying quiet would be easier. It might mean having a brief, uncomfortable conversation today, rather than letting it drag on unresolved for another week. Each time you choose the slightly harder, more direct path, instead of the easier avoidance, you are sending your mind a clear message. Discomfort is survivable, and I am someone who moves toward it rather than away from it. This message compounds over time. After enough repetitions, situations that used to feel intimidating start to feel merely uncomfortable, and situations that used to feel uncomfortable start to feel almost routine. Power, the quiet kind we are building here, also depends on how you spend your attention throughout the day. Every time you scroll through other people's curated lives, comparing your unfinished, ordinary days to their highlight reels, you are quietly feeding your mind evidence that you are behind, that you are not enough, that everyone else has it figured out while you struggle. This comparison is almost always based on incomplete information, since nobody posts their doubts, their arguments, their failed attempts, or their quiet fears. Limit this input deliberately. Choose specific times to check these things, rather than letting them interrupt you constantly. And notice how your baseline mood and confidence shift simply by reducing this one source of distorted comparison. Training your mind daily for confidence and power is not about eliminating fear or doubt completely. Even the steadiest, most capable people you will ever meet still feel a flicker of nervousness before something important. The difference is not the absence of fear, it is the relationship they have built with it through consistent practice. They have trained their self-talk to be accurate rather than harsh. They have built a written record of their own competence instead of dwelling only on their failures. They have practiced direct language instead of constant hedging. They have used their posture and breath as tools rather than ignoring the body entirely. They have rehearsed difficult moments mentally before facing them in reality. They have separated useful criticism from personal attacks on their worth. They have chosen small discomforts on purpose instead of avoiding everything that feels hard. None of these practices require special talent or unusual circumstances. They require attention and repetition applied to the ordinary minutes of an ordinary day. Begin with just one of them today. Notice your self-talk the next time you make a small mistake and correct the harsh language into something more accurate. That single act, repeated tomorrow and the day after, is the actual beginning of the confidence and quiet power you are building, not someday in the future, but starting right now, in this very ordinary moment, with the mind you already have. Chapter 4. Release fear and doubt to unlock your true potential. Fear has a strange way of disguising itself as wisdom. It tells you it's just being careful, just being realistic, just protecting you from a painful outcome. And because it sounds so reasonable, most people never question it. They simply obey it, year after year, watching opportunities pass by while telling themselves they're being smart, not scared. This is one of the great quiet tragedies of human life. Not loud failure, not dramatic collapse, but the slow, invisible erosion of potential because fear was never named for what it actually was. Doubt works alongside fear, but it operates differently. Where fear screams danger, doubt whispers you're not capable. Doubt is quieter, and in many ways more dangerous, because it doesn't even need a specific threat to point to. It simply suggests, again and again, that you are somehow less equipped than the moment requires. Between fear and doubt, most people spend their entire lives operating at a fraction of what they're actually capable of. Not because the capability isn't there, but because these two forces have convinced them not to test it. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The fear you feel before a difficult conversation, a big decision, or an unfamiliar challenge is almost never actually about the present moment. It is usually a prediction, a story your mind has constructed about what might happen, built from old memories, second-hand warnings, and imagined worst-case outcomes that haven't occurred yet and may never occur at all. Your nervous system cannot fully distinguish between an imagined threat and a real one. It reacts to the story the same way it would react to the actual event. This means that most of the fear governing your daily decisions is reacting to something that exists only in your imagination, not in your actual circumstances. Understanding this does not make the fear disappear instantly, but it does something just as valuable. It gives you the ability to question the fear instead of simply obeying it. Most people never reach this step because they never separate the feeling of fear from the truth of their situation. They feel afraid, and they assume the fear is an accurate signal about real danger, so they comply with it automatically. The moment you start treating fear as a signal worth examining rather than a command worth obeying, you take back a piece of control that most people never realize they were missing. There is an old practice, used long before modern psychology gave it new names, of deliberately imagining the worst outcome of a feared situation in vivid, specific detail, rather than avoiding the thought. This might sound like the opposite of helpful advice. Why would you want to dwell on the worst case? But there is real value in this exercise because vague fear is far more paralyzing than specific fear. When fear stays vague, it can expand without limit. Your mind treats it like an unmapped territory, filling in the blanks with whatever feels most threatening. But when you sit down and actually write out, in detail, what the worst realistic outcome of your feared situation looks like, you give the fear a shape and a boundary. You can then ask a simple, practical question. If this worst outcome actually happened, what would I do next? Most of the time, the answer reveals that the worst case, while uncomfortable, is also survivable. You would feel embarrassed, or you would lose some money, or you would have to start over in some way, but you would still be standing, still capable of taking another step. This single exercise, repeated regularly, slowly drains fear of its exaggerated power, because you stop treating it as an unlimited threat and start treating it as a specific, manageable possibility. Doubt requires a slightly different approach, because doubt doesn't usually point to a specific outcome. It points to your own perceived inadequacy. The voice of doubt says things like, "Who are you to attempt this?" or "You'll probably fail like you did before," or "People more qualified than you have already tried and failed." The mistake most people make is arguing with doubt using pure willpower, trying to drown it out with forced enthusiasm. This rarely works for long, Because doubt, like fear, responds better to evidence than to volume. Instead of shouting over doubt, interrogate it. When doubt tells you that you're not capable, ask it directly, in your own mind, what evidence supports that claim? Often you'll find the evidence is thin, outdated, or based on a single past failure that has been generalized far beyond what it actually proves. One failed attempt 3 years ago does not prove permanent incapability. It proves that one specific approach, at one specific time, under one specific set of conditions, did not work. That is a much smaller and far less threatening claim than the broad sentence doubt originally tried to hand you. Consider how this plays out in something as common as starting a new venture, applying for a role that feels slightly out of reach, or finally pursuing a skill you've quietly wanted to learn for years. The doubt that shows up in these moments rarely arrives with specific, logical reasoning. It arrives as a feeling, a tightness, a vague sense of not being ready yet. And because there is always more to learn, more experience that could theoretically be gained, this feeling of not being ready yet can be used to justify delay indefinitely. People wait for a feeling of complete readiness that, for most meaningful pursuits, simply never arrives, because growth happens through the attempt itself, not before it. The carpenter does not become skilled by reading about wood for another year. The skill develops through the cutting, the mistakes, the adjustments made in real time. Waiting for fear and doubt to fully disappear before acting is waiting for a condition that the action itself is what actually produces. This brings us to one of the most useful distinctions you can make in this entire process: the difference between useful fear and useless fear. Useful fear is connected to genuine physical or serious practical danger, the kind that protects you from real harm, like the instinct that makes you cautious near a dangerous road, or careful with your finances during an unstable situation. This kind of fear deserves your attention and respect. Useless fear, on the other hand, is the kind that shows up around social risk, the fear of looking foolish, being rejected, being judged, failing in front of others, or simply trying something new and falling short of your own expectations. This second category makes up the overwhelming majority of the fear that keeps people from their potential, and it deserves a very different response than useful fear. Where useful fear should be heeded, useless fear should be acknowledged honestly, and then walked through anyway. Because the actual cost of this second kind of fear coming true is almost always smaller and more survivable than the mind suggests. Building the habit of walking through useless fear repeatedly is what eventually produces something that looks, from the outside, like natural courage. But it is rarely natural. It is trained, the same way any skill is trained, through repetition under real conditions, rather than through a single, dramatic moment of bravery. Start with small, low-stakes versions of the fear you want to overcome. If public speaking terrifies you, don't wait for a high-pressure presentation to test your courage for the first time. Speak up in a small meeting this week, even just to ask a single clarifying question. If asking for what you're worth feels impossible, don't wait for the biggest negotiation of your career to practice it. Ask for a small discount, a small adjustment, a small favor this week. Somewhere the stakes are low. Each small rep builds evidence, and that evidence becomes the foundation that doubt can no longer easily dismiss, because you are no longer arguing in the abstract. You have actual proof from your own recent experience that you can act despite discomfort and survive it intact. There is a particular kind of freedom that arrives once you stop needing fear and doubt to disappear before you act. This shift changes the entire texture of how you move through difficult situations. Instead of waiting at the edge of every challenge for some internal permission slip that says you're ready, you learn to act alongside the discomfort, treating it as background noise rather than a stop sign. Your hands might still shake before the hard conversation. Your stomach might still tighten before the unfamiliar task. But you walk forward anyway, because you've trained yourself to recognize that the shaking hands and tight stomach are not reliable indicators of actual danger, just familiar physical responses to anything new or socially exposed. It helps to remember that almost every person whose life or work you admire has walked through this exact same internal weather. They were not immune to fear and doubt. They simply built a different relationship with these feelings than most people ever attempt to build. They did not wait for confidence to arrive first, and then take action as a reward. They took the action while the fear and doubt were still present, and the confidence arrived afterward, as a result of having proven something to themselves through direct experience that no amount of internal pep talk could have proven on its own. This order matters enormously, and getting it backward is one of the most common reasons people stay stuck for years. Confidence is not the prerequisite for brave action. It is the byproduct of it. Self-talk plays a critical role here as well, though in a slightly different way than building general confidence. In moments of acute fear or doubt, the goal is not to argue yourself into feeling fearless. That rarely works in the moment itself, because strong emotion does not respond well to logical argument delivered in the heat of the experience. Instead, the goal is to speak to yourself the way a steady, experienced mentor would speak to someone they respected, but who was clearly nervous. A good mentor does not say, "Don't be afraid," because that dismisses the very real feeling happening in your body. A good mentor says something more like, "It makes sense that you're nervous. This matters to you. Now let's take the next small step anyway." Practice this exact tone with yourself the next time fear or doubt shows up before something important. Acknowledge the feeling honestly. Then redirect attention to the smallest possible next action, rather than the entire overwhelming outcome. Fear and doubt tend to focus on huge, abstract outcomes, the entire project, the entire relationship, the entire risk. Action lives in much smaller units. The next sentence, the next email, the next phone call. Shrinking your focus down to that next small unit makes the feeling far more manageable, because you are no longer trying to face the whole mountain at once. There is also real value in examining where your particular fears and doubts originally came from, not to dwell on the past, but to recognize that many of these patterns were inherited rather than personally chosen. A person raised in an environment where mistakes were met with harsh criticism often grows into an adult who treats every small risk as a potential disaster, even in completely different circumstances where the stakes are actually low. A person who watched a parent struggle financially might carry deep, often unconscious doubt around their own ability to handle money well, regardless of their actual current skills and circumstances. Recognizing the original source of a particular fear does not automatically dissolve it, but it does create useful distance. You begin to see the fear as an old pattern responding to an old situation, rather than an accurate current assessment of your present capability. This distinction, this is old programming, not current truth, is often enough to loosen the grip these patterns hold over your present decisions. Releasing fear and doubt does not mean reaching some permanent state where these feelings never appear again. That expectation sets you up for unnecessary frustration, because fear and doubt are part of being human, woven into the same nervous system that also gives you the capacity for love, excitement, and connection. The goal is not elimination. The goal is a working relationship, one where fear and doubt are allowed to exist as quiet background commentary, occasionally worth listening to when they point toward genuine danger, but no longer treated as the final authority on what you are capable of attempting. This shift, practiced consistently over weeks and months, slowly unlocks a version of you that has been present the entire time, simply waiting for permission you no longer need to ask for, from feelings that were never qualified to grant it in the first place. Today, find one specific place in your life where fear or doubt has been quietly setting the boundary on what you attempt. It might be a conversation you've been avoiding, a skill you've wanted to start learning, an opportunity you've talked yourself out of more than once. Write down, specifically, what the worst realistic outcome actually looks like, and what you would do if it happened. Then take one small action toward that thing today, not the entire leap, just the next smallest possible step. This is how potential gets unlocked, not through a single dramatic breakthrough, but through this same small, repeatable act of acknowledging the fear, examining the doubt, and choosing to move forward anyway, one ordinary moment at a time, until the pattern that once held you back becomes the very evidence that proves you no longer need it to. Chapter 5. Strengthen your thoughts to align with abundance and prosperity. Two people can lose the same amount of money in the same week and end up living completely different lives 5 years later. Not because of what happened to their bank accounts, but because of what happened inside their heads in the days right after. One person replays the loss on a loop, turning it into fresh proof of an old belief, something like "I was never good with money," or "things like this always happen to me." The other person feels the exact same sting, the same tightness in the chest when they check the balance, but within a few days they start asking a sharper question. What does this teach me? And what is my next move from here? Same event, two different internal responses. Those responses, repeated across months and years, build two very different futures, and almost nobody examines this process closely enough to see it happening in real time. This is the actual mechanism behind what people call an abundance mindset or a prosperity mindset, and it has nothing to do with wishing on good fortune or pretending hard news doesn't exist. It is closer to training a muscle that controls attention. Your mind cannot process everything happening around you at once, so it builds filters, shortcuts, that decide what gets noticed and what gets ignored. Whatever you rehearse most often becomes the filter your mind defaults to without asking your permission. Walk down the same street as someone who has spent years rehearsing scarcity, and they will notice the closed shop, the rising price on the coffee, the parking ticket stuck under a wiper. Walk down that same street as someone who has spent years rehearsing prosperity, and they will notice the empty storefront with potential, the gap in the market nobody has filled yet, the small business doing something clever with no competition nearby. Neither person is lying about what they saw. Both saw real things, but one mind was trained to search for lack, and the other was trained to search for opening. And a trained mind finds exactly what it has practiced looking for. Scarcity thought has a recognizable shape once you know what to listen for. It speaks in absolutes. There's never enough. If they win, I lose. I need to grab this now before it disappears. People like me don't get chances like that. Notice how none of these statements are really about the external world. They are conclusions, delivered with total certainty, about situations that are usually far more open and undecided than the thought admits. This kind of thinking produces specific, observable behavior. It makes people hoard instead of invest, gripping tightly to what little they have, rather than putting any of it toward growth. It makes people rush into bad deals out of fear that the opportunity will vanish. Instead of taking the time to evaluate it properly, it makes people undervalue their own time and skill, accepting less than fair payment, because some part of them believes asking for more will scare the opportunity away entirely. And it turns every interaction into a hidden competition, even ones that were never meant to be won. because a mind convinced that resources are fixed will always see another person's gain as proof of its own coming loss. Prosperity thought has a different shape, and it is worth being precise about what it actually is, because it gets confused with blind optimism far too often. It is not the belief that everything will work out regardless of effort. It is the belief that value can be created, not just divided up among a fixed number of people. A mind trained this way looks at a market that seems saturated and asks what gap nobody has noticed yet. Instead of concluding that the door is closed, it is comfortable investing time, money, or effort before seeing a guaranteed return, because the underlying belief is that more can always be built through the right kind of work, the same way a farmer plants a seed without standing over the field unable to act simply because the harvest isn't immediate. This way of thinking treats a hard problem as raw material. Somewhere inside every unsolved problem is a need that someone hasn't met yet, and meeting real needs is the actual root of almost every fortune that has ever been built, far more than luck or timing ever was. There is an old discipline, far older than any modern wealth seminar, that fits naturally into this conversation, and it has to do with drawing a clear line between what is yours to control and what has never been yours to control in the first place. You do not control the broader economy. You do not control whether a client says yes or a market shifts against you. You do not control what other people decide to do with their money, their attention, or their loyalty. Scarcity thought spends almost all of its energy exactly here, in the territory you were never given authority over, resenting competitors, fearing headlines, blaming circumstances, replaying decisions made by other people, as though staring at them long enough might change them. Prosperity thought redirects nearly all of that same energy toward the narrow strip of ground you do actually control. The skill you choose to build this month, the effort you put into the work in front of you, the way you respond when a deal falls through, the discipline you bring to how you spend, save, and direct what you currently have. This is not a small shift. It is the difference between spending your limited daily energy arguing with the weather and spending it building the kind of shelter that holds up, regardless of what the weather decides to do. Try this the next time you catch a scarcity thought about money or opportunity moving through your mind, because catching it is the necessary first step before any of this becomes useful rather than theoretical. The moment you notice yourself thinking, "I can't afford this," pause and ask a sharper, more useful version of the same question. What would actually need to be true for me to afford this? And which part of that is within my control to start building right now? The moment you notice yourself thinking there's no work out there for someone like me, ask instead, where exactly have I looked? And what specific skill, if I built it over the next few months, would open doors I currently can't even see? Notice the difference between the original thought and the corrected one. The original is a closed door delivered as fact. The corrected version is an open question pointed directly at something you can actually act on today. This single habit, repeated honestly every time scarcity language shows up, slowly retrains the filter your mind defaults to under pressure. Comparison deserves its own honest treatment here, because almost everyone feels a flare of something uncomfortable when they see someone else doing visibly well, especially someone who started in a similar place. The common advice is to simply look away, to limit how much of other people's success you let yourself see, and there is some real value in that for protecting your daily mood. But there's a more useful move available once that initial sting passes. Instead of treating the discomfort as something to suppress or hide from, treat it as a piece of information you haven't fully read yet. Ask yourself specifically, what is it about their position that actually pulls at me? Is it the freedom in their schedule? the recognition they're receiving, the sense of security behind what they've built, the creative control they clearly have over their own time. Naming the exact thing turns a vague cloud of bitterness into a specific target, and a specific target is something you can actually move toward. Vague envy just sits in the chest and rots. Named envy becomes a strange kind of map, pointing directly at a desire you hadn't fully admitted to yourself yet. Every thought you repeat functions like a deposit, and this is worth taking seriously, rather than treating as a poetic turn of phrase. A single anxious thought about money passing through your mind on a random Tuesday changes very little on its own, but a thought repeated daily, for months behaves the way money behaves when it sits somewhere long enough to compound. It builds on itself quietly, invisibly, day after day, and then one day you look up and notice the total has grown into something far larger than any single deposit could explain. Scarcity thoughts, repeated daily, compound into a mind that has become highly skilled at finding evidence for lack, rushing decisions, and undervaluing itself in negotiations, all without you ever consciously deciding to build that skill. Prosperity thoughts, repeated daily, compound into a mind that has become highly skilled at spotting openings, tolerating the discomfort of investment without guaranteed return, and staying steady through temporary setbacks. Before sleep tonight, take 30 seconds to notice the dominant money-related thought that ran through your head most often today. If it leaned towards scarcity, don't argue with it loudly or force a fake cheerful replacement. Simply state quietly and specifically a more accurate version before you close your eyes. Not "I'm going to be rich," which your mind will reject as false, but something closer to today was tight, and I still took one real step toward something better. This is a small deposit, but small deposits made every single night are exactly how compounding works. In either direction, there is also a meaningful difference between wishing for something and actually deciding on it, and prosperity thought leans entirely on the second one. Wishing stays vague by nature. I wish I made more money. I wish things were easier. I wish I had what they have. Vague wishes don't move anything, because there's nothing specific enough inside them to act on, and a mind left holding only vague wishes will eventually default back to scarcity language, simply because nothing else has been built to replace it. A decision looks different. It has an edge to it. I am going to learn this specific skill over the next 90 days, and I am going to offer it to 3 people by the end of the first month. That sentence is uncomfortable in a useful way, because it can actually be checked. Either you did it or you didn't. Trade your wishes for decisions wherever you can this week, even small ones, because a mind that has practiced turning vague wanting into specific checkable commitment slowly stops generating so much vague wanting in the first place. This kind of thinking should change how you actually look at your own money too, not just how you talk to yourself in the abstract. Knowing your real numbers, what comes in, what goes out, what you actually keep at the end of each month, is not a punishment to avoid. It is simply data, and a trained mind looks at data the way a scientist looks at a result, with curiosity, not the way a prisoner looks at a verdict, with dread. Avoiding your own numbers because looking feels shameful is scarcity thought wearing the disguise of self-protection. Looking clearly on a regular basis, without flinching, is prosperity thought in its most practical form. There's also a difference worth knowing between frugality, born from fear, and resourcefulness, chosen on purpose. Denying yourself something out of a constant low hum of anxiety is not the same as deliberately directing your money toward what actually matters to you, while consciously choosing to spend less elsewhere. The first comes from a tight, constricted place. The second comes from a clear, intentional one, and they can look identical from the outside while feeling completely different from the inside. Prosperity, examined honestly, was never only about cash sitting in an account. Your skills, your relationships, your energy, and your time are real assets. The same way property or stock can be a real asset, and the same scarcity thinking that grips a bank balance too tightly can also grip these other resources without you noticing. Someone who refuses to teach what they know because they're quietly afraid that sharing it will somehow use it up is applying scarcity thinking to knowledge. Even though knowledge, unlike money, doesn't actually shrink when it's given away. Someone who treats every relationship as a transaction requiring an immediate, measurable payoff is applying scarcity thinking to connection, even though the richest relationships almost always grow slowly, well before any clear benefit is visible. Watch for scarcity patterns showing up in these quieter corners of your life, not just around money, because a mind trained to grip tightly in one area rarely stays generous and open in every other area by accident. Start today with the single thought about money or opportunity that feels the most fearful, the most closed, the one that shows up most often and carries the most weight when it does. Write it down exactly as it sounds in your head without softening it. Then, write beside it. Write the corrected version, the one shaped as an open question pointed at something inside your control. Then do one small, concrete thing today that backs the corrected version rather than the original. Send the message you've been putting off. Check the number you've been avoiding. Name the specific thing behind the envy you've been carrying, and take one step toward it. None of this requires a dramatic leap or a sudden windfall to begin working. It requires the same thing compounding has always required, a small, accurate deposit made consistently, until the total becomes impossible to ignore. Chapter 6. Master your emotions to create unstoppable personal magnetism. There is a particular type of person who walks into a tense situation and somehow the temperature in the room drops. The argument that was building loses its momentum. People who were bracing for conflict find themselves breathing a little easier. This person didn't raise their voice or take control by force. They simply remained steady while everyone around them was tilting, and that steadiness pulled the whole room toward calm. This is one of the clearest, most observable forms of personal magnetism, and at its root is something most people never deliberately develop. The ability to feel a strong emotion fully without being controlled by it. Most people live at the mercy of their emotional weather. When something good happens, they soar, sometimes recklessly, making promises and decisions in a rush of excitement they'll later regret. When something bad happens, they crash, withdrawing, snapping at people who didn't deserve it, or freezing entirely. Their inner state is dictated almost entirely by what just happened to them in the last few minutes, which means anyone or anything in their environment can move them like a puppet on strings, simply by changing what happens around them. A person like this is exhausting to be near, not because they're a bad person, but because being around them means constantly bracing for which version of them will show up next. Unpredictability, even pleasant unpredictability, keeps other people slightly on guard, and people do not feel drawn to those they have to stay on guard around. The first thing to understand about mastering emotion is that mastery does not mean suppression. This distinction is everything, and getting it wrong leads people into a cold, brittle imitation of self-control that fools no one and slowly damages them from the inside. Suppression is pushing the feeling down, pretending it isn't there, gritting your teeth and presenting a flat surface to the world while a storm rages underneath. This doesn't work for long. Suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It leaks out sideways, in a sharp tone you didn't intend, in tension that lives in your shoulders and jaw, in sudden eruptions over something small because the real pressure had nowhere else to go. People can sense suppression too. They feel the gap between the calm face and the held-back storm, and that gap reads as inauthenticity, which quietly repels rather than attracts. Mastery is something entirely different. It means letting the emotion arrive fully, feeling it completely, acknowledging it honestly to yourself, and then choosing your response from a place of awareness rather than reaction. The feeling is allowed. The automatic behavior that usually follows the feeling is what you learn to interrupt. Anger is allowed to exist in your body. Throwing the cruel comment back is the part you learn to pause. Disappointment is allowed to wash through you. Collapsing into a sulk that poisons the next 3 days is the part you learn to interrupt. The emotion and the reaction are two separate things. Even though they normally happen so fast, they feel like one single event. Almost all emotional mastery lives in the tiny space you learn to open up between them. That space has a physical foundation, and understanding it makes the whole thing far more practical than it sounds. When a strong emotion hits, your body responds before your thinking mind has fully caught up. Your heart rate climbs, your breathing shortens, stress chemistry floods your system, and a more primitive part of your brain takes the wheel, the part built for immediate survival rather than thoughtful response. In that state, you are genuinely less capable of wise decisions, not because you're weak, but because the biology of high emotion temporarily narrows your thinking. This is why the single most useful skill in emotional mastery is learning to recognize this physical surge the moment it begins, before it fully captures you. The tight chest, the heat rising in the face, the urge to immediately speak or act, the clenched stomach, these are early signals. Most people miss them entirely and only notice their emotion after they've already reacted. Training yourself to catch the physical signal early gives you the one thing high emotion tries to steal from you, a moment of choice. When you catch that early surge, the most reliable tool you have is your breath, and specifically the length of your exhale. This is not vague advice. There is a direct physical connection between a slow, extended exhale and the calming branch of your nervous system. A long exhale, noticeably longer than your inhale, sends a physical signal through your body that the immediate emergency is passing, which begins to lower the stress response that's hijacking your thinking. The next time you feel a strong emotion start to rise, before you say or do anything, take one slow breath where the exhale lasts roughly twice as long as the inhale. This single, almost invisible act does something powerful. It restores enough access to your thinking mind that you can actually choose your next move instead of being dragged into the automatic one. Nobody around you even needs to know you did it. From the outside, it simply looks like a person who paused for a moment before responding, and that pause itself is magnetic because it signals control. Consider how this plays out in a real situation almost everyone faces. Someone says something dismissive or unfair to you in front of others in a moment that matters. The automatic reaction is immediate. Heat rises. A sharp response forms instantly in your mind, and the urge to fire it back is almost overwhelming. The person who has never trained this fires back, and the situation escalates, and even if they technically win the exchange, they've revealed that they can be controlled by a single sentence from someone else. The person who has trained this feels the exact same heat, the exact same sharp response forming, but takes one slow breath first. In that breath, the thinking mind comes back online, and a better question becomes available. Is this person worth responding to at all? Is there something true buried in the unfair delivery? What response actually serves me here, rather than the response that just feels satisfying for 2 seconds? They might still address the comment, but now they do it from steadiness, with a measured tone that often disarms the other person entirely and quietly raises their own standing in the eyes of everyone watching. Same trigger, completely different outcome, decided entirely in that one breath. The magnetism this produces is not subtle once you start looking for it. People are drawn, almost magnetically, toward those who remain composed when composure is hard. They want this person in the room during a crisis. They want this person leading the project when things get tense. They confide in this person, trust this person, follow this person, because the steadiness communicates a deep and reassuring message. This is someone who will not add chaos to an already difficult situation. In a world where most people amplify whatever emotional energy is already present, the rare person who lowers it becomes extraordinarily valuable and deeply attractive to be near. There is another dimension to this that goes beyond simply staying calm under pressure, and it has to do with the emotions you actively bring into a room, rather than just the ones you avoid spilling. Emotions are contagious in a way most people underestimate. Spend time with someone anxious, and you often leave feeling more anxious yourself, even if nothing in your own life changed. Spend time with someone genuinely warm and steady, and you often leave feeling lighter, more capable, more at ease. This happens largely below conscious awareness, transmitted through tone, expression, posture, and pacing. Once you understand this, you realize that the emotional state you carry into your interactions is not a private matter at all. It is something you're constantly broadcasting to everyone around you, shaping how they feel, and over time, how they feel about being near you. The person who consistently brings a steady, warm presence becomes someone others actively seek out, while the person who consistently brings tension and volatility becomes someone others quietly learn to avoid, even if they can't fully explain why. This does not mean performing fake happiness or forcing a relentless cheerfulness that ignores reality, that reads as hollow and, like suppression, creates a gap people can sense. It means taking responsibility for your own emotional state before you bring it to others, processing your difficult feelings in private rather than dumping them on everyone you encounter. When you arrive somewhere carrying frustration from an unrelated event, the disciplined move is to recognize it. Take a moment to settle yourself before walking in, and consciously choose not to let an unrelated frustration leak onto people who had nothing to do with it. This is not dishonesty. It is basic respect for the people around you, and it's a discipline that pays you back enormously, because you become known as someone whose presence improves a situation rather than complicating it. Handling your own difficult emotions in private requires having actual methods for processing them, rather than just hoping they pass. One of the most effective is simply naming the emotion precisely, out loud or in writing. There's a well-documented effect where the act of accurately naming what you're feeling begins to reduce its intensity, because naming engages the thinking part of your brain and gives the raw feeling a shape and a boundary. Instead of being swallowed whole by a vague, overwhelming bad feeling, you identify it specifically. This is disappointment about a specific outcome. This is anxiety about a specific upcoming event. This is hurt from a specific comment. The precision matters. The more accurately you name it, the more it shifts from a formless storm controlling you into a specific, manageable experience you're observing. Practice this whenever a strong emotion arrives. Pause and name it as precisely as you can. You'll often feel the intensity drop measurably within seconds, simply from the act of accurate naming. Another method involves changing your physical state when you're stuck in a difficult emotion, because, as established earlier, body and mind are constantly feeding signals to each other. When a heavy emotion has you stuck, deliberately changing what your body is doing can interrupt the loop. Standing up and moving when you've been sitting frozen in worry. Stepping outside into different surroundings and different light when you've been spiraling indoors. Washing your face with cold water when your thoughts are racing in a heated loop. These are not distractions from the emotion. They are direct interventions in the physical state that's helping sustain it, and they often create enough of a shift to break the grip of a feeling that pure willpower couldn't touch. There's a deeper layer to emotional mastery that separates those who manage their emotions occasionally from those who develop genuine, lasting steadiness, and it involves examining the stories you attach to events rather than just managing the feelings after they arrive. Most strong emotions don't actually come from events themselves. They come from the interpretation you place on the event, the story you immediately tell yourself about what it means. Someone doesn't return your message, and the feeling that follows depends entirely on the story you attach. If the story is they're ignoring me because they don't respect me, you feel hurt and resentment. If the story is they're probably busy, like I often am, you feel almost nothing at all. Same event, completely different emotional result determined by the interpretation. The masterful move is to notice that you're choosing an interpretation at all, since most people experience their first interpretation as simple fact rather than as one possible story among several. When a strong emotion arrives after you've named it, gently ask yourself what story you're telling about the event, and whether a different, equally possible story might be more accurate or more useful. This isn't about lying to yourself with a falsely positive spin. It's about recognizing that you almost never have complete information, and the harsh interpretation your mind defaults to is rarely the only one available, and rarely the most accurate. Building all of this takes time, and it's worth being honest that you'll fail at it regularly, especially at first. You'll catch the emotion too late, react in the old way, and only realize afterward what happened. This is completely normal and not a sign of failure. The skill builds through thousands of repetitions, and many of the early ones will be losses. What matters is that you review the losses afterward, without harsh self-criticism, simply noticing what triggered you, where you missed the early physical signal, and what you might do differently next time. Each review sharpens your ability to catch the next surge a little earlier. Over months, you'll notice that situations which used to hijack you completely now barely move you, and the gap between feeling and reaction, which started as something you had to force open with great effort, gradually becomes more natural and automatic. The magnetism that comes from all of this is the most durable kind there is, because it isn't based on appearance, status, or anything that can be taken from you. It's based on who you become through consistent practice, a person who can be trusted to stay steady when steadiness is hard, who improves the emotional temperature of the rooms they enter, who responds rather than reacts, and who has done the private work to handle their own storms without spilling them onto everyone nearby. This kind of person draws others naturally, not through any technique aimed at manipulation, but through the simple, rare quality of being genuinely safe and steady to be around in a world full of people who are neither. Start today with a single practice. The next time you feel any strong emotion begin to rise, whether it's irritation in traffic, frustration at a message, or anxiety before something difficult, do just one thing before you react. Take one slow breath with a long exhale and name the emotion precisely in your mind. That's the entire practice for today. One breath, one accurate name before the reaction. This small act, repeated whenever emotion rises, is the actual foundation of the steadiness and magnetism you're building, constructed not in some dramatic future moment, but in these small, ordinary moments where you quietly choose response over reaction, one breath at a time. Chapter 7. Visualize your wealth clearly to manifest real results daily. Most people picture wealth the way a child pictures a holiday, a vague warm glow of having arrived somewhere good, with no detail in it at all. They imagine a feeling of relief, a number in an account, maybe a house or a car borrowed straight from an advertisement. And then they're surprised when this fuzzy daydreaming produces nothing in their actual lives, and they conclude that visualization doesn't work. But what they were doing was never really visualization. It was wishing dressed up in pictures, and wishing has never built anything. The kind of mental practice that actually changes behavior is far more specific, far more demanding, and far more connected to action than the soft fantasy most people mistake it for. The first thing to understand is what visualization actually does inside you, because the popular version makes a promise it can't keep, and that false promise is worth dismantling honestly before we build anything real on top of it. Picturing money in your mind does not cause money to travel toward you through some invisible force in the universe. That story sells well and delivers nothing, and believing it tends to make people passive, sitting back and waiting for results that visualization alone was never going to produce. What clear mental rehearsal actually does is far more grounded and far more useful. It programs your attention, it shapes your decisions, and it prepares your nervous system for situations before you encounter them. These are real, observable effects, and they're more than enough to justify the practice, without needing to attach any magical claims to it. Start with attention, because this is the most immediately practical effect. Your mind, as established in earlier chapters, filters reality based on what you've trained it to search for. When you hold a specific, detailed picture of a goal in your mind regularly, you quietly instruct your filter to start noticing things related to that goal that it would otherwise have ignored completely. Someone who has vividly and repeatedly pictured launching a particular kind of business starts noticing conversations, problems, gaps in the market, and useful people that a person without that mental picture walks right past. The opportunities were always there. The detailed mental rehearsal is what tuned the person's attention to finally register them. This is not mystical in any way. It's the same reason that once you decide you want a particular kind of car, you suddenly see that car everywhere on the road. It was always there. Your attention simply wasn't tuned to it before. This is why the specificity of your visualization matters so enormously, and why the vague, warm glow version fails. A blurry picture gives your attention nothing precise to tune toward. Picturing yourself being wealthy in general tunes your filter to almost nothing useful, because wealthy in general is not something your attention can search for in the real world. But picturing the specific work you'd be doing, the specific kind of person you'd be serving, the specific problem you'd be solving, the specific skill you'd be using daily, gives your filter concrete things to start noticing in your actual environment. The clearer and more specific the mental picture, the more precisely your attention gets tuned, and the more real opportunities you start to register that were invisible to you before. This means the practice begins not with money at all, but with the work and the life behind the money, because that's where the actionable detail lives. Sit quietly and picture, in real detail, what your day actually looks like in the future you want. Not the bank balance, but the texture of the day itself. What are you working on when you first sit down? What kind of problem are you solving? Who are you talking to, and what are they coming to you for? What does the space around you look and sound like? What skill are you using that you're clearly good at? The money is downstream of all of this. It flows from the value you create through this specific work. So picturing the work in vivid detail is far more useful than picturing the reward in vague abstraction. When you build the mental picture this way, you're not fantasizing about an outcome. You're rehearsing a role, and rehearsing a role actually prepares you to step into it. There's a meaningful difference between two kinds of visualization, and understanding this difference is what separates the version that helps from the version that quietly hurts. The first kind is outcome visualization, picturing the end result already achieved, the success already arrived. The second kind is process visualization, picturing yourself actually doing the work, step by step, including the difficult parts. Research on this is fairly clear and somewhat surprising to most people. Outcome visualization alone, picturing only the finished success, tends to reduce motivation rather than increase it, because part of your mind treats the vividly imagined success as if it has already happened, draining away the drive to actually pursue it. Process visualization, picturing yourself doing the work, navigating the obstacles, handling the hard moments, tends to increase follow-through because it rehearses the actual behavior you'll need, rather than just the pleasant feeling at the end. This is a crucial correction to the popular advice, which almost always emphasizes picturing the dream outcome and almost never emphasizes picturing the work. Spend most of your mental rehearsal on the process, on yourself actually doing the things, and only a small amount on the finished result. Picture yourself, then, not just having built something successful, but in the middle of building it. Picture yourself making the difficult phone call and handling the rejection that follows without collapsing. Picture yourself sitting down to do the focused work on a morning when you don't feel like it and doing it anyway. Picture yourself in a negotiation, stating your value clearly and staying steady when the other person pushes back. Picture yourself recovering from a setback, feeling the disappointment, and then taking the next step regardless. This kind of rehearsal does something a fantasy of the finished result never can. It prepares your nervous system to handle the real moments when they arrive, so that the difficult situation feels slightly familiar instead of completely shocking, and familiarity is what allows you to stay composed and capable when it counts. This connects directly to how athletes and performers have used mental rehearsal for decades, not as a substitute for practice, but as a multiplier of it. A musician rehearses a difficult passage in their mind, fingers still, and their performance of it measurably improves, because the mental rehearsal strengthens the same neural pathways that physical practice strengthens, just less powerfully. The key word there is less. Mental rehearsal supports real practice. It never replaces it. Anyone who tells you that visualizing your goals is enough on its own, that you can picture your way to results without the corresponding action, is selling you a comfortable lie. The visualization tunes your attention and prepares your nervous system. But it's the action that those two improvements then make more effective. Picture this clearly so you never fall into the trap that catches so many people, treating the mental practice as the whole thing rather than as the preparation for the real thing. Here's a practice you can begin tomorrow morning that combines all of this correctly. Before you reach for your phone, before the day's noise floods in, spend about 5 minutes in a specific mental rehearsal. Spend the first minute picturing in vivid sensory detail the future role you're working toward, the actual work, the actual day, the texture of it. Then spend the next 3 minutes on process, picturing yourself doing the specific actions today that move you toward that role. See yourself doing the hard task you've been avoiding. See yourself handling the difficult interaction with steadiness. See yourself staying focused through the part that's usually boring. Make it detailed and make it realistic, including the difficulty, not a smooth fantasy where everything is easy. Then spend the final minute identifying the single most important action you'll actually take today toward that future, and commit to it specifically. This last step is what closes the loop between the mental practice and reality. Without it, you've just had a pleasant daydream. With it, you've tuned your attention, rehearsed the behavior, and committed to a concrete action, all before the day has even begun. The realism in your visualization matters more than the popular advice admits. And this is worth dwelling on, because it runs against almost everything people are usually told. Picturing a perfect, frictionless path to success actually works against you. Because when the real path turns out to be full of obstacles and setbacks, as every real path is, the gap between your smooth fantasy and the rough reality becomes discouraging. Your mind, having rehearsed only the easy version, treats the difficulty as a sign that something has gone wrong, that you've failed somehow, when in truth the difficulty was always going to be part of it. Far better to rehearse the realistic version, including the obstacles, so that when you hit them, your mind registers them as expected parts of the journey you already prepared for, rather than as evidence that the dream was wrong. Picture the rejection coming, and picture yourself handling it. Picture the slow stretch, where progress seems invisible, and picture yourself continuing through it anyway. This realistic rehearsal builds a kind of durability that the perfect fantasy actively undermines. It also helps enormously to give your visualization an emotional charge, but the right kind. The popular advice says to feel the emotion of already having achieved your goal, to generate the feeling of the wealth as if it's already here. There's a subtle problem with this, connected to what we discussed about outcome visualization draining motivation. Feeling the satisfaction of arrival too vividly can quietly tell your mind the work is done. Instead, attach the emotion to the doing, to the process, to the identity of becoming the kind of person who does this work well. Feel the quiet satisfaction of having done the hard task. Feel the steadiness of handling a difficult moment with composure. Feel the deep sense of being someone who follows through on what they commit to. These emotions, tied to the process and the identity rather than the finished outcome, fuel action rather than draining it, because they make the daily work itself feel meaningful and rewarding, rather than making the imagined endpoint feel already reached. There's a deeper purpose to all of this that goes beyond tuning attention and rehearsing behavior, and it has to do with identity. The way you see yourself shapes the actions you take far more powerfully than any goal written on paper. Someone who genuinely sees themselves as a disciplined, capable person who creates value will naturally behave in ways that match that self-image, because human beings work hard, often unconsciously, to act in accordance with who they believe they are. Visualization, used well, is partly a tool for gradually shifting your self-image. When you repeatedly and vividly picture yourself as someone who does focused work, handles difficulty with steadiness, and follows through on commitments, you're slowly updating your internal sense of who you are. And as that self-image shifts, your behavior shifts to match it, often without you having to force it through sheer willpower. This is one of the most powerful and least understood effects of consistent mental rehearsal. You're not just picturing a future. You're slowly becoming the kind of person for whom that future is the natural result. This is also why consistency matters far more than intensity in this practice. A single dramatic visualization session, no matter how vivid, changes very little. But a brief, focused rehearsal repeated every single morning gradually retunes your attention, rehearses your behavior, and reshapes your self-image through accumulation, the same way small daily deposits compound into something substantial over time. 5 focused minutes every morning will do far more for you than an hour-long session once a month. Build it into the start of your day. Attach it to something you already do reliably, like the first quiet moments after waking, and protect it as one of the most valuable few minutes of your entire day, because everything that follows in the day is shaped by the attention, preparation, and self-image you established in those minutes. One caution worth stating plainly, because it catches many sincere people. Visualization can become a sophisticated form of avoidance, a way to feel like you're making progress while actually doing nothing. It's far more pleasant to sit comfortably and picture your success than to face the rejection, the focused effort, and the uncertainty of real action. Some people fall in love with the rehearsal precisely because it lets them experience the feeling of progress without the discomfort of actual progress. Watch yourself honestly for this. The test is simple. After your mental rehearsal each morning, did you take the concrete action you committed to, or did the visualization become a substitute for it? If the picturing consistently replaces the doing, you've turned a useful tool into a comfortable trap, and it's time to shorten the visualization and lengthen the action. Begin tomorrow morning with the 5-minute practice exactly as described. 1 minute on the detailed future role, 3 minutes on rehearsing yourself doing the actual work and handling the actual difficulties, 1 minute identifying and committing to the single most important action you'll take that day. Then, and this is the part that makes the whole thing real, take that action during the day, regardless of how you feel when the moment arrives. The visualization tunes you and prepares you. The action is where the results actually live. Do both, consistently, every day, and you'll find that the gap between the future you've been picturing and the life you're actually living begins, slowly and then steadily, to close, not through any force outside yourself, but through the daily, compounding effect of an attention tuned toward opportunity, a nervous system prepared for difficulty, and an identity gradually reshaped into that of the person capable of building exactly what you've been picturing all along. Chapter 8. Cultivate gratitude daily to amplify your attracting power within. Gratitude has been so heavily marketed that the word itself has gone soft, worn down into a greeting card sentiment that most people nod along to and quietly ignore. They've been told to be grateful so many times, usually by someone telling them to stop complaining, that the whole idea has acquired a faintly hollow ring. So let's set the worn-out version aside completely and look at what gratitude actually does inside a person, mechanically, because the real thing has almost nothing to do with the soft sentiment and almost everything to do with how your attention, your decisions, and your relationships function day to day. Start with attention again, since so much of building a strong inner life comes back to where your attention is trained to go. Your mind cannot hold everything at once, so it constantly chooses what to focus on, and over time those choices harden into a default setting. A mind trained by habit to scan for what's missing, what's wrong, what's threatening, and what others have that you don't, becomes extremely skilled at finding exactly those things, until it can walk through a genuinely good day and register only the 3 small things that went poorly. This isn't a character flaw. It's an attention pattern built through repetition, and it produces a constant low-grade sense of lack, regardless of a person's actual circumstances. You've surely met someone with a great deal who still feels poor inside, and someone with very little who carries a strange richness in how they move through the world. The difference is rarely the circumstances. It's almost always the attention pattern running underneath. Gratitude, practiced as an actual discipline rather than a vague feeling, is the deliberate retraining of that attention pattern. It is the practice of regularly directing your focus toward what is present and working in your life, rather than only toward what is absent or broken. Done consistently, it slowly shifts your default setting so that your mind begins to register the good as automatically as it once registered only the lacking. This is not about lying to yourself or pretending problems don't exist. The problems remain real and still deserve attention. It's about correcting a filter that has become badly skewed toward the negative, restoring a more accurate and more useful balance to what you actually notice as you move through your days. Now connect this to the idea of attracting power, because the link is far more practical than mystical. The popular framing claims that feeling grateful sends out some kind of energy that pulls good things toward you through invisible means. Set that aside, because there's a far more grounded and far more reliable explanation for why grateful people genuinely do tend to attract more opportunity and better relationships. A person whose attention is trained toward appreciation simply behaves differently, and that different behavior produces different results in the real world. They notice and acknowledge the people who help them, which makes those people far more willing to help again. They approach their work from a place of sufficiency rather than desperate lack, which leads to steadier, less fear-driven decisions. They're more pleasant to be around, which means people seek out their company and bring them into more rooms where opportunities live. None of this requires any invisible force. The grateful person attracts more because the grateful person behaves in ways that naturally draw people and opportunities closer, and the resentful, lack-focused person repels both through behavior that, while understandable, pushes others away. Consider the difference in something as ordinary as how two people respond to receiving help. One person, trained toward lack, receives a favor and barely registers it, already focused on the next thing they need, treating the help as merely their due or as not quite enough. The person who helped them feels it, even if nothing is said. There's a subtle flatness in the response, an absence of real acknowledgement, and it quietly reduces their willingness to extend themselves again. The other person, trained toward gratitude, receives the same favor and genuinely acknowledges it, specifically and warmly, making the helper feel that their effort mattered and was seen. That helper walks away feeling good about the exchange and far more inclined to help again, and to mention this person to others as someone worth helping. Over years, these tiny differences in response compound into vastly different networks of goodwill, and goodwill is one of the most powerful and underrated forms of wealth a person can accumulate. The grateful person ends up surrounded by people who want to see them succeed. The lack-focused person ends up wondering why no one seems to go out of their way for them. This is why gratitude deserves to be treated as a serious daily practice, rather than an occasional pleasant feeling, and why the method matters as much as the intention. The most common version, listing a few things you're grateful for each day, can easily become mechanical and lose its effect, because the mind quickly turns any repeated list into background noise it stops actually feeling. Writing the same vague items every morning, my health, my family, my home, soon becomes an empty ritual that changes nothing, because you're no longer actually directing real attention toward those things. You're just listing words. To keep the practice alive and effective, it needs specificity, and it needs to be felt, not merely recorded. Here's a more effective approach. Rather than listing general categories, identify one specific thing from the past day, something small and concrete, and spend 30 seconds actually re-experiencing why it was good. Not my family in the abstract, but the specific moment your child said something funny at dinner, or your partner handled something difficult without being asked. Not my health in the abstract, but the specific fact that your body carried you through a long day without pain, or that you woke up able to move freely. The specificity forces your attention to actually engage rather than skim, and the brief re-experiencing is what gives the practice its real effect on your mood and your default attention pattern. One specific thing genuinely felt for 30 seconds, does far more than 10 vague items rattled off without feeling. There's a particular form of this practice that's unusually powerful, and almost no one does, because it runs against the grain of how we normally think. It involves directing gratitude toward difficult things, not in a way that denies their difficulty, but in a way that finds the genuine value hidden inside them, a setback that, looking back, taught you something you needed to learn, a rejection that redirected you toward a better path you couldn't see at the time, a difficult person who, through the friction of dealing with them, forced you to develop patience or boundaries you previously lacked. This is not about pretending hard things were secretly good, which would be a dishonest denial of real pain. It's about recognizing honestly that even genuinely difficult experiences usually contained something of real value, a lesson, a redirection, a strengthening, and choosing to acknowledge that value rather than only the pain. This practice builds a remarkable kind of resilience, because over time you train yourself to look for the usable element inside hardship, rather than being purely flattened by it. A person who has built this habit faces setbacks very differently than someone who experiences every difficulty as pure loss, with nothing redeemable in it. Gratitude also has a direct and underappreciated effect on the scarcity thinking we examined earlier. Scarcity thought runs on a constant background assumption that there isn't enough and that you're falling behind. Gratitude directly counters this, not through forced positive thinking, but by repeatedly drawing your attention to evidence of sufficiency that's already present in your life. It's genuinely difficult to maintain a panicked sense of total lack while your attention is regularly engaged in noticing what you actually have. This doesn't make you complacent or kill your ambition, which is a common fear people have about gratitude. The disciplined practice is to hold both at once: deep appreciation for what is already present, alongside clear, motivated intention toward what you're still building. These two are not opposites. The most effective people often hold both simultaneously, grateful for the current state while still driven to improve it, and this combination is far healthier and more sustainable than ambition fueled purely by a gnawing sense of never having enough, which burns people out and poisons their enjoyment of every success they do achieve. There's a physical and emotional dimension to all of this as well, because gratitude practice genuinely changes your actual state, not just your thoughts. When you sincerely direct your attention towards something good and let yourself feel appreciation for it, even briefly, it produces a real shift in your body and mood, a softening of tension, a small lift in your baseline emotional state. Done consistently, this accumulates. A person who spends even a few minutes daily in genuine appreciation tends to carry a more settled, more open emotional baseline through their days. And as we explored in the chapter on emotion, the state you carry is something you broadcast to everyone around you. The grateful person tends to bring a warmer, steadier presence into rooms, which connects directly back to the magnetism that draws people and opportunities closer. So the practice that began as a private retraining of your attention ends up reshaping how others experience being near you, which reshapes the opportunities that flow toward you. It's all connected, and gratitude sits closer to the root of it than most people realize. A word on the timing and placement of this practice, because when you do it affects how well it works. Many people do their gratitude practice at the end of the day, which has value. But there's particular power in doing it first thing in the morning, before the day's demands and frustrations have had a chance to set your attention pattern toward stress and lack. Starting the day by deliberately tuning your attention toward what's good and present establishes a baseline that the rest of the day's events then build upon, rather than trying to recover an appreciative state at night after the day, has already pulled you in the opposite direction. There's also real value in a brief moment of gratitude in the difficult middle of a hard day, used almost as a tool to interrupt a spiral, deliberately pausing to register something good when your attention has been captured entirely by what's going wrong. This isn't denial of the difficulty. It's a deliberate rebalancing of an attention that has tilted too far toward the negative, restoring enough perspective to respond to the difficulty from a steadier place. It's worth addressing honestly that gratitude can feel impossible or even offensive during genuinely terrible periods of life, and forcing it in those moments can backfire badly. When someone is in the middle of real grief, real loss, or real crisis, being told to be grateful can feel like a cruel dismissal of their pain, and rightly so. The practice described here is not meant to override genuine suffering or to paper over real tragedy with forced positivity. In the hardest seasons, gratitude may need to shrink down to the smallest possible thing, simply being grateful that you made it through another day, or that one person checked on you, or that the difficult night eventually ended. And sometimes, in the depths of real crisis, the practice may need to be set aside entirely until some of the rawest pain has passed. There's no virtue in forcing appreciation through genuine anguish. The daily discipline described here is meant for ordinary life, for the normal mix of good and difficult days that make up most of our time, where the real problem is usually not that life is unbearable, but that a skewed attention pattern is causing us to miss the genuine good that's already present. The compounding nature of this practice is what makes it so worthwhile despite its simplicity. And it's worth being patient with, because the effects are gradual rather than dramatic. A single day of gratitude practice changes almost nothing noticeable, but the practice done daily, for months, slowly retrains your default attention pattern, gradually shifting you from someone who automatically scans for lack into someone who automatically registers sufficiency and good. This shift, once it takes hold, affects everything downstream of it: your mood, your decisions, your relationships, your resilience in setbacks, and the presence you carry into every room. None of it arrives all at once. It accumulates quietly, the way water shapes stone, until one day you notice you've become a fundamentally more appreciative and more settled person than you used to be, and that the world seems to respond to you differently as a result, not through any change in the world itself, but through the profound change in what you've trained yourself to notice and how you've trained yourself to respond. Begin tomorrow morning, before you reach for your phone or let the day's demands flood in. Identify one specific, concrete good thing from the previous day and spend a genuine 30 seconds re-experiencing why it mattered, actually feeling the appreciation rather than just noting the fact. That's the entire practice for the morning. Then, if a hard moment arrives during the day, use a brief pause to register one good thing present even in the difficulty, as a tool to rebalance your tilted attention. And once a week, take a single difficult experience from your past and honestly look for the genuine value it contained, the lesson, the redirection, the strengthening. These 3 small practices, done consistently, are the actual work of cultivating gratitude, not as a soft sentiment, but as a serious discipline that retrains your attention, reshapes your relationships, deepens your resilience, and quietly transforms the presence you carry into the world, one specific, genuinely felt moment of appreciation at a time. Chapter 9. Transform setbacks into fuel for your continued personal growth. Everyone fails. That part is not in question. What separates people is not whether setbacks arrive, because they arrive for everyone regardless of talent, effort, or good intentions. What separates people is what they do in the days and weeks immediately after a setback lands. During that fragile window when the meaning of the event is still being decided inside their own mind. The same failure can become the turning point that launched everything, or the wound that quietly ended a person's ambition, and which one it becomes is determined far more by the internal response than by the failure itself. The first thing worth understanding is that a setback and the story you tell about a setback are two completely different things, and most of your suffering comes from the second one rather than the first. The event itself is usually finite: a deal collapsed, a business closed, a relationship ended. A project you poured yourself into was rejected. These events, however painful, are bounded. They happened, they're over, and they occupy a specific place in time. The story, though, can expand without limit. The story says, "This proves I'm not capable." The story says, "This always happens to me." The story says, "I should have known better. I'm too far behind now. People like me don't recover from things like this." The story is where a single bounded event gets stretched into a sweeping verdict about your entire worth and your entire future, and that stretching is almost always inaccurate and almost always far more damaging than the event that triggered it. So the first move when a setback lands is to separate the two with ruthless honesty. Write down, in plain factual language, exactly what actually happened, stripped of all interpretation. Not "I failed because I'm not good enough," which is a story, but the specific factual version. "I launched this. These specific things happened. The result was this." When you force yourself to describe only the facts, without the editorializing your mind wants to add, two things usually become clear. First, the actual event is smaller and more specific than the cloud of doom your mind had built around it. Second, the harsh verdict you were carrying was an interpretation you added, not a fact the event proved. This separation alone, done honestly, removes an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering, because it strips away the part of the pain that was never accurate to begin with. This does not mean denying real responsibility, and this is an important balance to hold. There's a crucial difference between honest accountability and crushing self-condemnation, and confusing the two is one of the most common ways people sabotage their own recovery. Honest accountability sounds like this: "I made these specific mistakes. Here is what I'd do differently, and here is what I'll change going forward." It's specific, it's actionable, and it points toward improvement. Crushing self-condemnation sounds like this: "I'm a failure. I always ruin things. There's something fundamentally wrong with me." It's global, it's vague, and it points toward nothing but despair. The first kind of self-examination is the engine of growth. The second kind is the engine of paralysis. The skill is to take full, honest responsibility for the specific things that were actually within your control, while firmly refusing to extend that responsibility into a sweeping condemnation of your whole self. You made specific mistakes. That's true and worth examining closely. You are not, therefore, a fundamentally broken person. That's the false leap, and learning to stop making it is one of the most important skills in turning setbacks into fuel rather than letting them become quicksand. There's a useful practice here, drawn from how the most resilient people actually process failure, that involves treating a setback the way an investigator treats an accident, with curiosity rather than blame. After a plane has a near miss, the investigators don't gather to decide whose fault it was and how much they should be punished. They gather to understand exactly what happened, what factors contributed, and what could be changed to prevent it next time. Their entire focus is on extracting usable information for the future, not on assigning shame about the past. Apply this same investigative posture to your own setbacks. Once the initial emotion has passed enough that you can think clearly, sit down and study the failure the way an investigator would. What actually contributed to this? Which factors were within my control, and which weren't? What specific thing, if I had done it differently, might have changed the outcome? What can I extract from this that makes me more capable next time? This posture transforms a setback from a source of pure pain into a source of genuine education, and the information you extract this way is often more valuable than anything you could have learned from a smooth success, because failure tends to reveal exactly where your understanding or your approach was weak in a way that success never does. This points to something that sounds like a platitude, but is actually a precise and useful truth. Failure contains information that success cannot provide. When something works, you often don't know exactly why it worked, and you can't be sure which parts were skill and which parts were luck. Success is a poor teacher in this sense because it doesn't show you your weaknesses. Failure does. A setback reveals with painful clarity exactly where your approach was flawed, where your assumptions were wrong, where your preparation was insufficient, where your skills fell short. This information is genuinely valuable, and the people who grow fastest are often those who have learned to mine their failures for it systematically, rather than fleeing from the discomfort of examining them. The pain of the setback is the price of admission to a kind of knowledge that comfort and success simply can't teach. Most people pay that price and then throw away what they bought, refusing to actually examine the failure closely enough to extract the lesson, which means they suffer the pain without gaining the education, the worst of both worlds. Now let's talk about the emotional side honestly, because the practical advice to study your failures objectively means little if you can't first manage the genuine emotional impact of a real setback. Significant failures hurt, and they should. There's a kind of toxic advice floating around that suggests you should be able to bounce back instantly, feeling nothing, treating every setback as immediately fine. This is neither realistic nor healthy. Real setbacks deserve real grief, and trying to skip past the legitimate emotional processing usually means the unprocessed feeling lingers and leaks out in other ways later. The healthy approach is to allow yourself a defined period to genuinely feel the disappointment, the frustration, the grief of the failure, without rushing it and without wallowing in it indefinitely. Give yourself permission to feel terrible about it for a bounded time. Feel it fully. Then, when that period has passed, deliberately shift from feeling into learning, from grief into investigation. This sequencing matters enormously. Skip the grief entirely, and the unprocessed pain undermines you later. Stay in the grief indefinitely, and you sink into it. The skill is to feel it fully, and then, at a chosen point, deliberately turn toward what comes next. Consider how this plays out in a real and common situation. Someone builds something over months or years, a business, a creative project, a career path, and it fails. The collapse is real and the loss is genuine. The person who has not learned to process setbacks does one of two damaging things. They either refuse to feel the loss at all, immediately throwing themselves into the next thing to avoid the pain, which means they never extract the lessons and often repeat the same mistakes, or they collapse entirely into the loss, treating it as proof that they should never try again, and they quietly retire their ambition, telling themselves they're being realistic when they're actually just defeated. The person who has learned to process setbacks well does something different. They let themselves genuinely grieve the loss for a real but bounded period. Then they sit down and study what happened with honest curiosity, extracting every usable lesson they can find. Then they consciously decide what they're carrying forward, both the practical lessons and the proof that they can survive a significant failure and continue. And then they begin again, wiser and, crucially, less afraid of failure, because they've now proven to themselves that failure, while painful, is survivable, That last point deserves emphasis, because it's one of the most valuable things a setback can give you. Before your first real failure, failure exists in your mind as a kind of monster, an unknown catastrophe that you imagine would destroy you, and the fear of this imagined monster constrains everything you attempt. After you've actually been through a significant failure and come out the other side still standing, still capable, still moving forward, the monster shrinks dramatically. You now know, from direct experience rather than imagination, that you can fail and survive. This knowledge is profoundly liberating. It allows you to take the kinds of bold risks that meaningful success usually requires, because you're no longer paralyzed by an exaggerated fear of an outcome you've already proven you can withstand. In this sense, surviving a setback, well, actually expands your future capacity for ambition, because it removes the invisible ceiling that the fear of failure had placed on everything you were willing to attempt. There's a deeper reframe available here, one that the most resilient people seem to internalize over time. They come to see setbacks not as interruptions to their path, but as part of the path itself, an expected and even necessary part of any genuinely ambitious pursuit. If you're attempting things that are actually difficult and worthwhile, you will fail sometimes, not because you're inadequate, but because difficult, worthwhile things have a meaningful failure rate built into them. A person who never fails is almost certainly not attempting anything difficult enough to matter. Once you internalize this, setbacks stop feeling like evidence that you've gone wrong and start feeling like evidence that you're actually in the arena, attempting things of real significance. This reframe doesn't make setbacks painless, but it removes the additional layer of suffering that comes from believing the setback means something has gone fundamentally wrong with you or your path. The setback is not the path going wrong. The setback is the path, the real path, the one that has difficulty woven through it, precisely because it's leading somewhere worthwhile. It also helps to deliberately look backward at your own history during a current setback, because almost everyone has already survived things they once thought they couldn't. Think back to a past difficulty that, at the time, felt overwhelming, like something you'd never recover from. Now notice that you did recover, that life continued, that the thing which once consumed you has become a smaller and more distant part of your story. This is not to minimize your current pain, but to give you accurate evidence from your own life that your current sense of permanent catastrophe is almost certainly inaccurate. The mind, in the grip of a fresh setback, tells you this one is different. This one really is the end, but your own history usually says otherwise. Keep a record, even a mental one, of the difficulties you've already survived, and return to it during new setbacks as evidence that your capacity to recover is real and proven, not just hopeful. There's a practical discipline worth building around how you talk about your setbacks to others as well. Because the narrative you repeat out loud shapes the narrative you believe internally. There's a difference between honestly acknowledging a failure and rehearsing a victim story about it. Honestly acknowledging it sounds like, "That didn't work. Here's what I learned. Here's what I'm doing next." Rehearsing a victim story sounds like, "This happened to me. It wasn't my fault. The world is against me. There was nothing I could do." The first keeps you in the position of an agent who can act and improve. The second places you in the position of a passive victim who can only suffer what's done to them. Be careful which story you rehearse, because the more you tell a particular version of your setback, the more deeply you come to believe it, and the version that casts you as a learning agent serves your future far better than the version that casts you as a helpless victim, even when there were genuinely unfair factors involved. Acknowledging unfairness honestly is fine and sometimes important, Building your entire identity around it is a trap that keeps you stuck long after the setback itself has passed. The accumulation of well-processed setbacks over a lifetime builds something genuinely valuable that no smooth, easy path could ever produce. A deep, earned confidence rooted in proven resilience rather than in untested hope. The person who has failed significantly several times and recovered each time, extracting lessons and continuing forward, develops a quiet, unshakable steadiness that's immediately apparent to others and impossible to fake. They've stopped fearing failure in the paralyzing way most people do, because they've made peace with it as a survivable and even useful part of any worthwhile pursuit. This steadiness, this earned resilience, becomes part of the magnetism we've discussed throughout, because people are deeply drawn to those who have been tested and have not broken. There's a substance to such a person that the untested simply don't have, and it draws opportunity, trust, and respect in ways that no amount of unbroken good fortune ever could. When your next setback arrives, and it will, move through it deliberately rather than letting it move you. First, separate the factual event from the story your mind wants to build around it, writing down only what actually happened in plain language. Second, give yourself a real but bounded period to genuinely feel the disappointment, neither skipping it nor sinking permanently into it. Third, once that period passes, sit down and study the failure with an investigator's curiosity, extracting every usable lesson while taking honest responsibility for the specific things within your control without condemning your whole self. Fourth, deliberately identify what you're carrying forward, both the practical lessons and the renewed proof that you can survive failure and continue. And fifth, begin again, wiser and less afraid, knowing from direct experience that you've now added one more survived setback to the growing record of your own proven resilience. This is how setbacks become fuel rather than wreckage, not through avoiding them, which is impossible, but through processing them with such skill and honesty that each one leaves you more capable, more knowledgeable, and less afraid than it found you. Chapter 10. Commit fully to lifelong growth and lasting financial freedom. There comes a point in any real pursuit of growth where the early excitement fades, and what's left is the quiet, unglamorous work of continuing. The motivation that carried you through the first weeks burns off, the novelty wears thin, and you're left facing the same practices on an ordinary Tuesday when nobody is watching and nothing feels inspiring. This moment, the moment after the excitement dies, is where most journeys quietly end, not with a dramatic failure but with a slow drifting away. And it's precisely here, in the unglamorous continuation, that lasting growth and real financial freedom are actually built, because they were never built by inspiration in the first place. They were built by what you keep doing long after the inspiration left. The first thing to understand about lifelong growth is that it requires a fundamental shift in how you think about the whole endeavor, from a project with an endpoint to a permanent way of living. Most people approach self-improvement and wealth building as a temporary push toward a finish line, after which they'll be done, and can relax back into how they used to be. This framing almost guarantees failure because it treats the new behaviors as a temporary detour rather than a permanent change in who you are. The person who loses weight on a temporary diet and then returns to old habits regains everything, because they never actually changed their identity, only their behavior for a while. The same is true for every form of growth. The shift that produces lasting results is the shift from "I'm doing these practices for now" to "this is simply who I am now." When the disciplined behaviors become part of your identity, rather than a temporary effort you're enduring, they stop requiring constant willpower and start running on the much more sustainable fuel of self-image. You don't have to force yourself to do what a person like you naturally does. This connects to one of the most important truths about long-term change. It's driven far more by identity than by goals. Goals are useful for direction, but they have a built-in problem. Once you reach a goal, the behavior that got you there often stops, because the goal was the entire point, and now it's done. Someone whose only goal is to reach a certain amount of money often finds that once they reach it, the discipline that built it evaporates, and the money along with it, because the underlying identity never changed. Identity works differently. When you come to see yourself fundamentally as a person who continually grows, who handles money wisely, who creates value, who follows through, then the behaviors flow naturally from that self-image, regardless of whether any particular goal has been reached. The goal becomes a milestone along an endless path rather than a finish line where everything stops. Build your sense of who you are around the ongoing process of growth itself, not around any single destination, and you'll find the behaviors sustain themselves through seasons that would have defeated a purely goal-driven approach. Now let's talk honestly about financial freedom, because the phrase gets used loosely and means different things to different people, and clarity here matters enormously. Lasting financial freedom is not primarily about reaching some specific large number, though numbers matter. It's about reaching a state where your resources, your skills, and your habits combine to give you genuine choice over how you spend your time and energy. This is built on a few foundations that have nothing to do with luck or sudden windfalls. The first is the gap between what you earn and what you spend, because no amount of income produces freedom if your spending rises to consume all of it, which it tends to do automatically unless you consciously prevent it. A person earning a modest amount, who consistently keeps a meaningful gap between earning and spending, and directs that gap toward building assets, will reach genuine freedom long before a high earner who spends everything they make. This is not exciting advice, and it's not new, but it's true in a way that most exciting financial advice is not, and the unexciting truths are the ones that actually work over decades. The second foundation of financial freedom is the continuous building of skills that create real value for other people, because your ability to earn is ultimately rooted in your ability to provide something others genuinely need. This is why lifelong growth and financial freedom are so deeply connected that they belong together in the same chapter. The person committed to continually developing valuable skills becomes steadily more capable of earning, more resilient to economic shifts, and more able to create opportunities rather than wait for them. Skills, unlike many assets, can't be taken from you, don't lose value in a market crash, and compound over time as each new skill builds on the foundation of the previous ones. Investing in your own capability is one of the most reliable forms of wealth building available, and it's entirely within your control, requiring no permission, no luck, and no large starting capital, only the consistent commitment to keep learning and improving over years rather than weeks. The third foundation is patience with compounding, which is genuinely one of the most powerful and least intuitive forces in both finance and personal growth. Human beings are wired to expect roughly linear results, where steady effort produces steady, proportional progress. But compounding doesn't work that way. For a long time, compounding produces results that seem disappointingly small, because the base it's building on is still small. Then, as the base grows, the same rate of growth starts producing larger and larger absolute results, and progress that felt invisible for years suddenly becomes dramatic. This pattern holds for invested money, for accumulated skills, for the habits we've discussed throughout this book, and for the reputation and relationships you build. The critical implication is that the early period, where effort seems to produce little visible result, is not a sign that the approach is failing. It's the necessary foundation-building phase that precedes the dramatic later growth. And the people who quit during this slow early phase, concluding that it isn't working, abandon the process right before the compounding would have begun to pay off substantially. Understanding this gives you the patience to continue through the unrewarding early stretch, which is exactly the patience that most people lack, and that separates those who reach freedom from those who don't. This patience requires a particular relationship with time that runs against the grain of how most people think. We tend to dramatically overestimate what we can accomplish in a short period and dramatically underestimate what we can accomplish over a long one. A year feels like a long time, so we expect a year of effort to transform our lives, and when it doesn't, we get discouraged. But 5 years, 10 years, 20 years of consistent effort compounds into transformations that would seem impossible from where you stand today. The person who commits to consistent growth and wise financial habits and simply continues through the unglamorous middle years where progress feels slow ends up in a position that would astonish their earlier self. The secret isn't intensity, it's duration. Modest, consistent effort sustained over a long enough period beats intense effort that burns out after a few months, every single time. Commit to the long timeline, make peace with the slow early progress, and let compounding do the work that effort alone never could. Consider how this plays out across a real life rather than a single year. Picture two people starting from a similar position. The first chases intensity, throwing themselves into ambitious efforts in bursts, burning bright and then burning out, abandoning each push when the early results disappoint, restarting repeatedly from scratch with each new burst of motivation. The second commits to modest, sustainable consistency, building skills steadily, maintaining the gap between earning and spending year after year, continuing through the slow stretches without quitting. In the first year or two, they might look similar, or the intense person might even appear to be ahead during their bursts. But across a decade, the difference becomes staggering. The consistent person's skills have compounded. Their assets have compounded. Their reputation has compounded. Their habits have become effortless parts of their identity. The intense person, meanwhile, has a collection of abandoned starts and little accumulated progress, because they kept resetting before compounding could take hold. This is not a story about talent. Both people may have been equally capable. It's a story about the profound long-term power of sustainable consistency over unsustainable intensity, and it plays out in real lives constantly. Sustaining this consistency over years requires building systems rather than relying on motivation, because motivation is, by its nature, unreliable and temporary. Motivation comes and goes with your mood, your circumstances, and your energy levels, and any approach that depends on feeling motivated will collapse the moment the motivation fades, which it always does. Systems are different. A system is a structure you build that makes the desired behavior happen regardless of how you feel. Automatically directing a portion of your income towards savings and investments. Before you ever see it is a system, and it works whether or not you feel disciplined that month. A fixed time each day dedicated to skill building, protected and habitual, is a system that continues even on days you don't feel inspired. The practices throughout this book, the morning stillness, the visualization, the gratitude, the emotional regulation, become sustainable when they're built into systems and routines rather than left dependent on daily motivation. Design your life so that the good behaviors are the default, the path of least resistance, the thing that happens automatically, and you remove the exhausting need to summon willpower fresh every single day. There's a danger worth naming directly on this long path, which is the trap of comparison stretched across different timelines. When you commit to a long-term process of growth, you'll constantly encounter people who appear to be further ahead, achieving faster results, reaching milestones you haven't reached. This comparison can be corrosive, tempting you to abandon your steady approach in favor of whatever seems to be working faster for someone else, or simply discouraging you into quitting. But you almost never see the full picture of another person's path, the years of invisible foundation building behind their sudden visible success, the advantages or circumstances that don't apply to you, or in some cases the unsustainable shortcuts that will collapse later. Your only useful comparison is between who you are today and who you were a year ago. Are you more skilled, more disciplined, more financially secure, more resilient than you were? If the trajectory is upward, the process is working, regardless of how it compares to anyone else's apparent position. Keep your eyes on your own path and your own trajectory, and let other people's journeys be their own. It's also worth addressing what financial freedom is actually for, because pursuing it as an end in itself tends to produce a hollow result. A person who accumulates resources but never actually claims the freedom those resources were meant to provide. Freedom is valuable because of what it allows: the ability to spend your time on what matters to you, to weather difficulties without desperation, to be generous when you choose to be, to pursue meaningful work without being trapped by financial necessity, to care for the people you love. Keep this purpose in view throughout the long process, because the purpose is what sustains the effort through the years when the accumulation itself feels meaningless. The money was never the point. The life the money makes possible is the point, and remembering this keeps the whole pursuit grounded in something worth pursuing, rather than turning into an empty accumulation that never delivers the freedom it promised. Everything in this book connects here, in the commitment to continue. The inner energy you learned to cultivate, the magnetic qualities you began building, the confidence you trained daily, the fear and doubt you learned to walk through, the prosperity thinking you practiced, the emotional mastery you developed, the visualization you used to tune your attention, the gratitude that reshaped how you see, the resilience you built from setbacks. None of these produce their full effect from a brief period of practice. They produce their effect through years of consistent application, compounding quietly until they've transformed not just your circumstances, but the fundamental kind of person you are. The person who practices these things for a month gets a taste. The person who builds them into a permanent way of living gets the full transformation, because these practices, like compound interest, deliver their largest returns only to those patient enough to sustain them across a long enough timeline. So the final commitment is not to a goal, but to a direction, a permanent orientation toward growth that doesn't end when any particular target is reached. It's the decision to become permanently a person who continues learning, who handles resources wisely, who builds value, who maintains the inner disciplines, and who keeps moving forward through both the rewarding seasons and the slow, unglamorous ones. This commitment, sustained over years and decades, is what produces both the lasting growth and the genuine financial freedom that the quick, intense, temporary efforts never deliver. Make peace with the long timeline. Build systems that don't depend on motivation. Let compounding do the heavy lifting that effort alone cannot. Keep your comparison limited to your own past self. Hold the real purpose of freedom clearly in view. And above all, simply continue through the ordinary days when nothing feels inspiring, because the continuing itself, sustained far longer than most people are willing to sustain it, is the entire secret that this book has been pointing toward from the very first page. Start today, not with a grand gesture, but with the quiet decision to make these practices a permanent part of who you are, rather than a temporary effort you're trying out. Choose the few practices from this book that matter most to you. Build them into systems that will continue regardless of your daily motivation, and then commit to the long, patient, unglamorous work of simply continuing them, year after year, through every season, trusting that the compounding effect of sustained consistency will, in time, deliver a transformation far greater than anything a brief burst of intensity could ever produce. That decision, made today and renewed quietly every ordinary day that follows, is where lasting growth and real financial freedom truly begin.